Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera kepada pendengar dan juga penonton siri Melawan Lupa. Siri Melawan Lupa ni adalah salah satu daripada siri yang ada di dalam program-program kawah buku untuk mengingati tokoh dan juga peristiwa yang lepas, khususnya mereka yang jarang diangkat oleh media ataupun sejarah arus perdana. Program Melawan Lupa pada hari ini adalah sempena dengan pemergian seorang tokoh besar yang mungkin ramai orang, kalau siapa-siapa yang mendengar ni tak kenal, mungkin first time dengar. Jadi kita akan memulakannya dengan memperkenalkan tokoh yang akan kita bincangkan dan bicarakan pada hari inilah, iaitu 3 hari bulan April tahun 2021 dan 3 April juga adalah hari pemergian tokoh besar ini. Saya akan memulakan perbincangan ini di dalam bahasa Inggeris. Permulaan ni, mukadimah ni, kita menggunakan bahasa Melayu, bahasa kebangsaan kita. Tetapi untuk perbincangan seterusnya, saya akan menggunakan bahasa Inggeris dan kemungkinan kita akan campur-campur sikit lah antara bahasa Inggeris dan juga bahasa Melayu. Okay, this would be a very informal conversation, yeah. So before we start, I think it's better for me to introduce, our resource person.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm Sharaad, and as you know, we've worked together before. And my relationship to the man you haven't actually mentioned, his name, you haven't mentioned his name.
Yes.
Is James Puthucheary.
Yeah.
He's my uncle. So he's my maternal uncle. So my mother's elder brother. And as a consequence, and I must say from the very start, Koi, I don't think I'm the best person to speak to, but I know we're in a COVID situation and there are a lot of people who are much older and therefore a little more vulnerable, and at this point in time maybe it's more difficult to access. But yes, I mean, from the start there would be his brother Dominic Puthucheary, who's still alive and very well. There are historians like Wong Gang-woo who were contemporaries with him at the university. His widow, Mavis Puthucheary, who's an academic. She's very much alive and she knows his history much more intimately than I do. I know it as a member of the family, and of course, to the extent I've read about his life, I've done that, and I can say something of it, and I can help in this discussion about remembering who he was.
Yes. Yeah. Because actually, for our audience, we at the beginning, we are thinking to have a Sharaad Kuttan, have a conversation with Dr. Po Sukai. But unfortunately, this is Po Sukai is a suggestion by Sharaad lah, because when we talk about, we need to remember James Puthucheary and who's the best person, to talk to, Sharaad suggests his contemporaries lah. One of them is Dr. Po Sukai. But unfortunately, Dr. Po Sukai is in Negeri Sembilan, and with pandemic and also our concern lah about safety. Yeah? So we have to cancel, with a conversation with Dr. Po Sukai and Sharaad Kuttan. Now, Sharaad Kuttan and me.
Yeah, okay. That's fine. So I will, give and share as much as I know, Koi, about my uncle. And you can make, and please translate, what kesimpulan apa yang saya kata tentang arwah pakcik saya. So, I mean, at any time you want to start, we can start with the most basic stuff. But
let's start, because I think not many people, know who is James Puthucheary. Who is James Puthucheary? What is his background? What is his where he go to schools? What is his activities? Particularly during university years. All that stuff. As an introduction for the audience, who is James Puthucheary?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you said he was a tokoh besar, right? So
it is tokoh besar, right?
Yes. So
tokoh besar. You know why? Yeah. Because I did some research lah. I did some research. First time I heard the name James Puthucheary is from Hishamuddin Rais lah. So Hisham was like mentioning, he said in Malay lah, kau tahu tak, masa James Puthucheary meninggal, when James Puthucheary was passed away, Mahathir, during that time, he's a prime minister, he went down and give his last respect. Who in Malaysia, that have that kind of opportunity, the most powerful, man in Malaysia, the prime minister at that time, give his respect, to the late James Puthucheary. That's why he's a giant.
He I think, made a lot of contributions to thinking about Malayan economy.
Yes.
I think that was very clear. And yes, you're right. Dr. Mahathir had attended the memorial service for my uncle, for James, at that point in time. Along with him, he was not even in the program. He just came and sat very quietly somewhere back in the hall. And then he was recognized and he was invited up to say a few things. And he was quite choked with emotion. I think, I'll talk to you a little bit about what I understand about their personal relationship. But on that panel was Wong Gang-Wu, the historian, who's still alive and still writing. So maybe again context, right? Maybe family context. We could start with, and I'd start with the fact that he was not born in Malaya; he was born in India. So he was part of. So he came as a young boy with his father, or rather with his mother. To Malaya. His father had already come to Malaya, right? Before that. So, but he was the first of 10 siblings. He was the eldest.
Wow, 10 siblings.
10 siblings, right? So my mother is number 5 or something. He was number 4 maybe. And he was the first.
How can you don't even remember?
I know the order. I had to go through my mind to figure out which one.
So your mom is the fifth sibling? The fifth.
Yeah.
So Jim is the first.
Yeah.
Anak sulung lah.
Yeah. So there were 3 of them who were born in India. So to understand a little bit, so my grandfather, James's father, had studied at the University of Madras, and he had studied mathematics, right? And he wanted to come to Malaya. So this would be in the 1920s to be a teacher. But there weren't any jobs as teachers. The 1930s, maybe 1930s. And he ended up getting a job as a police officer. So my grandfather served in the colonial police service in Malaya. Right? But he came first. He was already married. And there were 3 kids. And so my grandmother and the 3 kids sailed on a steamship called the Rona. I know this because I did a bit of research to write about him when he passed away. Okay, so they came over, and then and this was before the war years. And then of course the other kids came along. But by the time the war came, James was already a teenager, late teens. And one of the first political...
Second World War, yeah.
The Second World War,
Yeah.
right? So one of the first political acts that that he ends up getting involved in is deciding to join the Indian National Army in its anti-colonial campaign. So he went to Burma to fight the British.
Wow.
So this happened as a late teen. So if you remember Subhash Chandra Bose...
Yeah, because that's very interesting, when you mention about Chandra Bose, because Bose Tamam, I think Ahmad Bose Tamam, the name Bose, come from his inspiration, of Chandra Bose. So your uncle, James Puthucheary, joined
the Indian
National Army and fight against the British.
Yes, he fought the British in the campaign. So you have to understand, right? So there's a sociologist, a political scientist, Kobute, who's written actually quite a bit. Kobute has written quite a bit on
Paradox of Mahavirism.
Right?
Yes.
It's his big book. It's actually his PhD work.
Yeah.
But he does a small piece, an essay in a collection called Flows, where he talks about James's life. And why he uses James is because James' life mirrors some of the big events of the 20th century. Right? And, anti-colonialism, nationalism, some of the real intellectual struggles of the time, which had to do with the relationship to the decolonized world, to the metropolitan centers, the question of equality and justice, and how do you reshape the economy so that it can produce justice, right? So all that was coming later, but what you have to understand that in my family, on my maternal side, James was like the patriarch, because my grandfather died in the 50s, right? So James was the eldest and in that style.
Yeah.
But James was also part of a world that was changing. So, my mother describes it. My mother's very good. Actually, my mother's really a person you should speak to if you want to understand James, or at least, a dimension of James, is that the family had changed. They'd come to Malaya. All the assumptions about how Malayali, a Keralite society. So I told you, my grandfather went to the University of Madras, but he's actually from Kerala, the Indian state on the west coast of India.
Okay, very interesting, because Kerala is one of the so-called, quote unquote, progressive state in India with very high literacy. And always, being ruled by the leftist party.
Yeah, well, I believe it
before.
Yes. I think it was the first democratically elected communist government in the world.
Yes,
it was in Kerala. But it's a state within the federation or the union of India.
Would that influence, James?
I don't know, because in the 30s, was that the most important thing? What we know of was nationalists were coming through Malaya to recruit, right? So you think of the Sun Yat-sens of the world.
Yes.
Subhash Chandra Bose had come to... and people did actually move about. And so, if you read the works of Tim Harper and Christopher Bailey, they document some of these wonderful facts of history. That there was a lot of conversations happening across Asia. So my uncle, like many young Malayans, were influenced by these speeches, people who came through.
Yes.
So the recruitment to the INA was very difficult, I imagine, for the family. Because he was the eldest son, but he was still quite young. And he was going off to war.
Yeah.
The Burmese campaign, and my uncle talked about this, well, he talked about it rather reluctantly when he was much older. It was a very painful one because a lot of people died. A lot of his friends died. The Burmese campaign was quite vicious. But he was very lucky. He survived. His father, who, as I said, was a police officer with the British colonial government, helped him, as I understand it, helped him get to India. So he found himself flown to India, right, through contacts that my grandfather had. And he landed in India and joined a university there, Tagore's University at Shantiniketan. So that's where he got some of his early education. And Kubutek actually documents this in his essay. one of the things that was happening in India at that time was India was, the partition. And my uncle drove an ambulance. So he participated in the partition.
Pakistan and India.
Right? Okay. So the partition of India into Pakistan, West and East Pakistan, was something my uncle was involved in. And these were very difficult developments in the struggle against colonialism. Because the struggle against, I guess, colonialism seemed a very clear one. You have the oppressor, the colonial, and then you have the oppressed.
Yeah, very black and white. Manichean way, of looking at, political situation. Yeah.
Yes. Yep. But then there were all these internal divisions within these new states. And so with India, it was the politics of this, what they call the two-nation theory, right? That there was a Muslim nation, and they needed their own land, and then there was, as well secular India. So I think these were perhaps, but my uncle never wrote about it. So as far as I know, there's no documentation about his thoughts on, on the problem of decolonization. But that was his experience. Before he returns to Malaya. And
when he returned to Malaya at that time, do you know, how old is he?
He would have been, I guess, in his late 20s or mid-20s.
So that means he's like, teenage when he, went to
war. I think it was like 17 or 18. Wow. Because this is all documented. I don't have these facts. I understand. Clearly prepared enough for this interview. But my uncle, Dominic Puthucheary, who was like the fourth child, and also, like James, very politically active. He, together with Jomo Sundram, put together a book, No Cowardly Past, which has a bit of a biographical sketch, which where all these facts are available. I don't have them at the tip of my fingers yet.
But when you said that No Cowardly Past, you mentioned about the book, it is interesting for me because I haven't read the book, Sharaad. I haven't read the book. But before our interview, I also, did my preparation, But there is not many information on James, And even in Wikipedia, usually, when you want to, learn at least to learn a basic things, basic knowledge, information about historical figure, usually you find in Wikipedia. But James is not in Wikipedia.
It was very interesting that you mentioned this because, I guess with Wikipedia, it really depends on people putting material together, right?
Yes.
But if you go to Singapore, there's, and because of James's role in Singapore, there is actually quite a bit of material. So the oral archive unit in Singapore has his interview, the interview they did with him. And you can actually, there's public access to that interview. And there's a bit written up on him. And and I think his Singapore days are were very significant politically, right? Before he returns to Malaysia and then leads a much more private life, though I think it's a little complicated initially. But so I just want to say something about, and I think this is when we look and talk about history, is to remember the social dimension of things that were happening. And, Christopher Bailey and Tim Harper, and the two brilliant books that anybody who's interested in the 40s should read, which is Forgotten Armies, Forgotten Wars.
Forgotten Armies
and Forgotten Wars, right?
Who's the author?
Tim Harper.
Tim Harper,
and Christopher Bailey. Christopher Bailey was actually Tim Harper's, the late Christopher Bailey, Tim Harper's supervisor in, I think they're in Cambridge. So, but this was the context, right? And in the social stuff, and I wanted to mention that I didn't get a chance, was, I was carried away with my own narrative, which is that my mother tells me, how my grandfather had told them to speak English to him.
To your grandfather?
Yeah. That they didn't speak Malayalam, which is their native language, to their father. They spoke Malayalam to their mother, but to their father they spoke English. They were told to speak English, and they were allowed to sit when talking to him. So if they were in the living room and the father was seated, children didn't sit with their parents. They stood, right? Yeah. But this was a world that was changing. And I think the recognition, and you also see it later on in their lives, the choices of spouses, which is very important. Because the expectation that they would marry within the community also was one of the, as it were, victims of this change in location.
No, within the community, within the
Malayali
community.
And Roman Catholic. So there are some photographs of James as...
James Roman Catholic?
He was born a Roman Catholic into a Roman Catholic family.
Roman Catholic family.
Yeah, okay. But as far as I know, he remained an atheist for most of his life, and held on as a young man. He really challenged us, individuals in the next generation who were not religious. So who were religious, he challenged us. Yeah. Okay, I'm personally an atheist too, like my uncle. Yeah. But so those kinds of expectations were changing, right? And it's very interesting. For me, that's a very interesting and often dimensions of the story that doesn't get told. Because it seems very personal, blah, blah, blah. And people are much more interested in the political side of people and their political involvement, not their personal choices. But their personal choices really also reflect what is happening in the world. Yeah? So this whole, you can sit with me, there's a sense of equality, right? The breaking down of hierarchy, right? And maybe a much more critical attitude towards the assumptions of the past, whether it's religious authority or political authority and such. Right? So James fights this terrible war, in the terrible campaign, that Subhash Chandra Bose and his people. And remember, they had set up in Burma something called it was the Government of India in Exile. And there's so many interesting characters in the Burma story. But anyway, so my uncle comes back, and at that point he joins the University of Singapore, University of Malaya in Singapore.
Okay, it's very interesting that it seems like there is a three world, from quite a lengthy introduction of who is James. One is the world of India, I would say. The other one is Singapore. The other one is Malaya, at that time. And it's very interesting for me that James willing, meaning to sacrifice his life, to join, war,
I don't know if he didn't say. I think he thought it's a mistake, by the way.
Oh, he thought it's a mistake.
Well, I don't know.
Because he believed in something, anti-colonial.
Yeah, that's right.
That have this sense of,
But Chandra Bose was a nationalist, but he was a fascist. Subhash Chandra Bose was a fascist, meaning he aligned himself to Mussolini and to the Japanese. In the same way, Aung San Suu Kyi's father and his cohort, General Aung San, was trained in fascist Japan. Right?
But I think we also need to understand the context at that particular time, and also the strategy, some of the nationalists, took at that particular point
I think
of time.
that, so when we use fascist today, we use it as a bad, as a kind of negative term. But actually fascism was an option. It was it comes out of your sense of how is society organized and how to move it, right? And do you need a strong leader, like a Mussolini, a Generalissimo, a Hitler, what was happening? Well, there was Emperor, was it Hirohito at that point? But these were options available. There's a Gunawan Muhammad writes about the 20th century and looks at all these interesting alliances that were made. Between Muslim and you're talking about Indonesia, Muslim forces and leftist forces. And he said, this was a time that things were possible. There was no contradiction in the left and forces defining themselves in religious terms working together.
So perhaps within that context that James make a choice to go to war.
So it's very important, I think, for us looking back at the past, not to bring the contemporary lens on that.
Of course.
And also not to hero worship. So I'm very concerned about the hero worship dimension of this, what I think of left nostalgia. But
okay. Because it's interesting, to go back, from what you've been, explain that, in a way, the way I see it, hearing, what you explained just now, that there is this internationalist tendency at the same time within, the thought of James Puthucheary. But I'm interested to know, how did he see, between, his go to war in Burma, against colonial British, in Indian National Army, but at the same time, he also politically active in Singapore. But then, before we go to, the banishment from Singapore, and he also quite active, in Malaya. How do you think he see, all this arena?
Okay, so it seems like you started by saying it's like three worlds, but actually I think the separation between these...
Or there's no separation for him at that time?
Oh, for most people.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think, if you think of colonial history and say where Singapore was managed, where was authority coming from, right? So it was I think for Singapore for the longest time, it was actually an office in India that directed, what was happening. So there were the Strait settlements, there was the unfederated Malay states, there was the federated Malay states, and there were, Johor, all these things, right? So people moved across these boundaries. I don't know how they saw it. The one thing about my uncle is, and I can safely say this without my relatives killing me at some point, is that he wasn't a prolific writer. So he didn't write very much. So he has, this rather famous book, we'll talk about it, right? And not much more that of any significance. There were historical documents maybe that have been lost, but I don't believe he wrote very much. As a child, there were things he was willing to talk about in terms of the past. But by the time I knew him, he had a very unsentimental, at least on the surface, an unsentimental attitude towards the past.
Okay.
So he didn't hold on. So if you talk about his banishment from Singapore and all that, Lee Kuan Yew came up in the conversation in the family, at dinner or conversation. There was never rancor, there wasn't a bitterness. He never described, at least to me, any bitterness towards Lee Kuan Yew. And often he told funny stories, about his encounters with Kuan Yew and all that. And or Harry, as they called him at that point in time. So so my personal view of him is somebody who had a very detached view of history. He didn't seem to like this hero worship of the past, and he was not really into that. It became rather private in his views. He had his own. Clearly he was still political in the sense that he was thinking about politics, but he wasn't very involved. And he certainly didn't, carry that socialist mantle that people associated with.
Yes.
He didn't celebrate that in any way. So I know when I was a young man and we all kind of have our first political feelings and identities, he was very unsentimental, and he kind of teased me about my leftist kind of thinking.
But James did join Barisan Socialis,
Yes. So Barisan Socialist was when the party, the PAP split, right? So the PAP split, he went with the Barisan Socialists. But what was his commitments, and to what extent, and this is very interesting, I think, because today we don't make a distinction between an ideological position or an analytical position that we have, an identity. So a lot of people think of socialism, as in identity terms. I'm a socialist, and it's my identity, it's my personality. Not my analytical system, not my sense of how to think about the world, which I think is different. So I must say, and I could be completely wrong, right? I mean, I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody. I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of my uncle. That I think he separated those two things. So what led him to write a book that looked at ownership and control, which is a very kind of, standard way that any left Marxist, socialist thinker would do, right? Because you think of the economy as being the foundations for structuring society, right? So his focus on that, marked him off intellectually as part of that world. But was he sentimentally attached to the iconography of the left? Did he think, he must have a portrait of Marx here, or Mao, or Lenin, or No, I don't think so. Okay. I don't think he was sentimental about the left.
Yeah, but how he saw himself?
Well, unfortunately, that's a question you have to put to him.
Yeah, I know.
Or his intellect.
Your perception,
Well, this is
how
it, right?
James think about, himself. Is he a nationalist? Because I've read, some of the research who categorize him, as a nationalist, anti-colonialist, as well as socialist. So which one?
Okay, so this is very interesting because I don't know. I don't know if we can say definitively what he was, except in looking at certain things he did. Clearly, as a teenager, he was swept up in the anti-colonial movement.
The wave,
Everybody was.
Yes,
Rasama Bhupalan joined the women's wing of the INA here, right? If you know...
this is my first time. This is
Mrs. Bhupalan, who became very famous for the women's movement in Malaysia, right? So there were all these young people, contributing. So for a lot of communities here, contributing to the politics back home in China, in India, Indonesia to some extent. All these people, right? There were people crossing back and forth, right? And I'm trying to think of this UMNO leader, woman leader, who's very famous, who talks about Tan Malaka coming and
Aisha Ghani, I think.
Aisha Ghani.
Aisha Ghani.
And it was like deep in Ampang. She told the story, right?
Yes.
So these people came. There were influences. People reading. People were, and a lot of it was sentimental, right? I mean, it was the great orators who came, and so I don't know if my uncle was an orator, right? So say a Lim Chin Siong, was a great orator apparently, and really could work up a crowd. Was my uncle like that? I don't think so. I think he was more like a policy wonk person who had these ideas about how to shape. So in Singapore, his contributions were to the Central Provident Fund. He was one of the originally. Also, the Housing Development Board was something that I believe he also contributed to in terms of things. So his contributions were in economic policy and planning.
Yeah, because you mentioned about the book, ownership and control in the Malayan economy. This is for our audience lah. I would say this is one of the important books, in looking at the economic structure, like you said, from a Marxist perspective, but criticizing, the way that the colonial administrator create the so-called ethnicized economic structure lah. And
not just so I don't think it was just economic. Ethnic, right?
Yep.
So it's also about foreign ownership.
Yes, foreign ownership. That's what I'm trying to explain. Usually when we look at economic system, how it was arranged, during the colonial time, usually we look it at Malay, Chinese, Indian. But this book, for me, I've read it, but this is like, tens of years ago lah, when I was like a student in sociology.
There's actually
sociology.
So this is actually, my uncle autographs this book. This is, you see,
to Sharaad? Was it?
That right there. Yeah. This is not an introduction to economics, but it's probably interesting.
Probably, but it is interesting.
This is my uncle's modesty.
But for me, this laid the foundation for academic literature and how to look, at the economic structure, not just through ethnic lens, but also at the class, because one of the arguments that I remember, when I read about it, is the creation of the so-called a group of a capitalist from a particular ethnic will help, alleviate poverty, which is, James is quite critical about it.
Yeah.
He also exposed, if I'm not mistaken, if I still remember, about the real ownership at that time, even until 1970s, Sharaad, is actually in the hand of the foreign companies, which is the British and European companies.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this book, right? So he's not alone in thinking and writing about the Malayan economy. So I think Lee Den Jen, wrote another thing called British Malaya, which is also a study of economics of British colonialism. But because he's one of the first to write about these things, right?
Yes,
so one of the first, not the only. So I think that's that. Also, what's really interesting about this book was it was largely done while he was in detention. Yes. So he was a political prisoner, a prisoner of the British colonial government in Singapore.
Yes.
But in this particular time he spent in prison, it was slightly different. It wasn't. They weren't being tortured. There was this feeling that these guys will eventually be the new leaders of Singapore. So they were allowed books. And there's these wonderful photographs taken by a guy called Anthony Schooling. He worked for the BBC in Singapore, and he was allowed into Changi prison and took photographs. And there were books piled up. There's a nice easy chair. My uncle is playing with these two dogs, two Cocker Spaniels, who were actually, I since found out, through my friend whose father started working in the prisons there. He's still alive.
Okay.
And a man called Muthu Kumarasamy. And he said those dogs were the warden's dogs. And one was called Gantung, and one was called I can't remember. But can you imagine a dog called Gantung in a prison? Okay, so and also his collaborator in this book, in terms of bringing material and talking and thinking about it, was the woman who was to become his wife, Mavis Sharnavale. Mavis Sharnavale, now Mavis Puthucheary, who worked at University of Malaya for many years. And who worked on public administration. So she also is a wonderful resource. If you want to understand how this book comes to be, talking to Mavis is, I think, crucial, right? So, but you're right. So the problem was, when you think about independence, when you think about justice, how deep does it have to go? Is it just, you have representatives in parliament, or is it about the economy of your country, your newly independent country, versus those metropolitan countries that are importing your produce and stuff and prices, right? So you have that development of economic thinking. Under development becomes a theory. Especially looking in South America and stuff. So Michael, I think that was his contribution, right? But also, I think when he's imprisoned by Lee Kuan Yew, I think there's a shift away from economics to the study of law. And so when he returns to Malaya, he becomes a lawyer, not an economist. But he does seem to be involved in a kind of informal networks. And I've written about this. Informal networks that supply people like Tun Razak perspectives on the economy.
Because I've read one article, written by Dean American, if I'm not mistaken. This is, quite a few years back. I was like, just, browse on the internet. And then, according to Dean American, James Puthucheary, the title, The Architect of NEP. Do you think, that title, to give to James, as the architect of the new economic policy, is it true? Or how, if it is true, how it come, into being, James Puthucheary because I know that, in this book, there is a suggestion, state intervention, particularly in order to correct, the imbalance that created by the colonial economy. I mean, colonialism, disrupt, particularly the balance within the society, inequality. So James was, suggesting, that there is a need for state intervention, to alleviate, to correct back, these inequalities created by the colonial political and economic system. So then American was saying that, the architect, of the so-called dasar ekonomi baru, or new economic policy, is if James not the creator or the architect, he germinates, the germinator, of the idea, that there is a need for NEP. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I've heard this as well. So, things as complex as the NEP.
Yeah.
Will there be a single architect? I don't know. But certainly, I think, and it's been said enough that it's probably true that he contributed to the thinking about how to do this, right? So, what happens in 1969 with the suspension of Parliament, and May 13th, is that you have a radical re-engineering of society led by UMNO, right?
Yes.
I think, I'm not well placed to kind of tease out who specifics and what part of NEP contributed to. But I think broadly that would be true. The question, of course, is, and I know this was also said some years later, was that what NEP became later on was not something he necessarily either anticipated or would have supported, right? The capture of NEP by an elite class for their own interest. That was something that he might or might not have supported. I mean, the suggestion was that he obviously didn't support that.
Yes.
Because in that way, NEP is taken in a very different direction.
Yeah.
So, but I think the question was that the terminal point of his contributions to economic policy thinking in Malaysia? Did he continue? Because he largely was a lawyer, and many of the leftist leaders of Singapore at that time, either they were in exile like Lim Chin Siong, or they had left Singapore to come to Malaya. Lim Chin Siong, I think, lived in Britain for a long time, and they led very quiet lives, or they went into the professions, and because politics was very dangerous for them, because people like Lee Kuan Yew was an authoritarian leader and had no. So Paul Sukai, you mentioned earlier, suffered, a long incarceration under Lee Kuan Yew. Said Zahari, long. I mean, we're talking about decades, right? Some of the longest surviving political prisoners were in Singapore, right, and in some extent Malaysia. But I mean, all these names, and maybe this is why I bring up this wonderful work by a Singaporean artist, and it's one. So this is not the finished work because I didn't have enough money quite to buy the work. I bought a study. So this
Singapore dollar,
Singapore dollar. So this is a work by an artist called Green Sun, and what he does is a kind of what they call a kind of speculative history. He's imagining in a future Singapore, there will be a recognition of leftist leaders from the Barisan Socialists, split up from PAP, who would be honoured by having their images on the notes. On notes. Yeah. So this one was for James.
Yeah.
In the finished work, you'll see James's face up.
Okay. But because this is interesting, because when I saw it just now when you show me, I couldn't figure it out. Who is this figure on the notes? Yeah.
So it's a series, right? So there's James, there's Fong Swee Suan, there's Lim Chin Siong. I can't remember all the leaders that were there. So it's Malayan Exchange is the name of the series. It's called Study of a Note of the Future.
But this is interesting, Sharaad. You know what? Because James, people, liken him to a socialist lah. But suddenly, the symbol of the, capitalism, the notes, the money,
But even socialists have to have a mode of exchange.
Yeah.
It will be it.
Yeah.
There is money in socialist countries. So but yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, so but the idea is that, like we have now, in the US. In the US, they recently put this very important African American woman activist, I think Sojourner Truth, on one of their notes, right? To get away from, because notes become like, we only have one image, right? The Agong, the first Agong that we had. I mean, we change our Agong every 5 years, but we don't change the note. We only have the first Agong, right? On the note, right? Yes. Only the signature of the governor changes sometimes. So Zeti, I think, is on the thing. Yeah. But so this is about honoring a people, right? So you talk about toko, right?
Yeah,
so the idea is that, in a Singaporean context, when will people like James, Lim Chin Siong, Fong Swee Swan,
Po Sukai,
what's his name, Sidney Woodhull, all these leaders, Said Zahari, when will they be honored as people who contributed to the nation? Right, who contributed to nation building, which is a term I don't like the term myself, but nation building in the sense that thinking about the problems, right?
Yes.
So Green does this work, thinking about. So this is it's 10 years old actually. It was done in 2011. But he gave this to me as a gift. Yeah. So that's.
I think, but part of it is also memorialization, of the important figure, of the past. Because I've read, one of your writing. I think it's about encounter with a photograph.
Yes. Yeah.
You wrote it with a Vox like some 10 years ago. 10 years ago.
So this is when my uncle passes away, right?
Yes.
So what I did was I tried to reconstruct the story. I mean, I didn't know. The thing about family is that nobody sits down and gives you a lecture. Yeah. History comes in little pieces over dinner, something somebody says, late night conversation.
I remember. Actually, it's quite beautiful line that you put it. Fragments of the past, something like that. I couldn't really remember the exact word that you used, fragments of past, So I would say, this artwork, that you showed just now is also, that fragments, of the past, which is trying to be immortalized in, interestingly, a Singapore note. Yeah. Which, goes to my question, how actually you think, about your uncle, James Puthucheary, perception about Malaya and Singapore, because he active politically in Singapore, but later on he was banished. I don't know what happened after, why he was banished. Perhaps you could explain to us, and also how actually at that time he saw both Singapore and Malaya.
Okay, I don't. Like I said, he didn't write very much about it, but let's put it this way, right? So he goes to university. The only university
is
in Singapore, right? It was
University of Malaya
before the branch was set up in Kuttan.
Raffles Institute, first, and then University of Malaya.
Raffles College. College. So and then there are people who's still alive, like Ronnie McCoy, who's in his 90s, like Dr. Mahathir, who went to there was a medical school in Raffles College, right? So before it became University of Malaya. So when my uncle was there as a student, and I say he was a slightly mature student because the war years had interrupted the education of many young Malayans. Universities were closed and stuff. Mavis Puthucheary has written a wonderful essay about the Socialist Club. Actually, it's an essay in honor of Wang Gangwu. It will be published soon. It's a series of essays in honor of Wang Gangwu, where she traces the emergence of a sort of non-sectarian, non-racial thinking about politics in Malaysia. How do you, and who was trying? So one of the groups was the Socialist Club, right? The Socialist Club was trying to think of Malaya, right? Trying to think of this new nation. What would it look like? Very interesting.
Including Singapore lah. Malaya without Singapore or Malaya with, okay.
So this is a very interesting point.
Yeah.
it's not simply about whether it's with or without Singapore, but what is the relationship, right? Because the
between Singapore and Malaya.
Yeah, between Singapore and Malaya.
Okay.
And also this larger, what would the larger entity be, right? So we know from, there's now a lot of material on this, right? Why was even Malaysia formed? Why was Malaysia formed? Why did it suddenly include the Borneo territories of northeast Borneo, what is now Sabah, and Sarawak? Why? Why wasn't Brunei included? Because we know from historical writings that it could have been included, except Tunku insulted the Sultan of Brunei and told him that your state is smaller than Perlis.
Yeah, that's one of them. But I think the main reason is definitely economic, because Brunei has to contribute oil quite a lot, to federal.
So and this is also, so there's quite a bit of writing now about the struggle over what this new nation would be. What would be which territories would be included? Because the future was also going to be democratic.
Yes.
Right? It was independent, but it was also going to be democratic. And democracy is a numbers game. So the numbers had to be calculated. The other problem, of course, was Indonesia. And Indonesia's view of the reshaping of the region. Right?
Antek British, kalau dalam bahasa Indonesia. The tools of a colonialist lah.
Yes, and we had confrontasi.
Yes, confrontasi.
So I know now, confrontasi is talked about as this great moment of patriotism that Malaysians showed, blah blah blah. My father was a naval officer and fought in confrontasi.
Interesting.
Okay. So and he was the commander of a minesweeper and did a lot of patrolling in the Borneo states, or the waters of the Borneo states. But but confrontasi was an Indonesian response to what they thought was a colonial project, right?
Yes.
Where was James in all this?
Okay, that's very interesting.
I think by the time we get to the battle for merger, right, it was the big referendum that was held, and the left of the party, the left in Singapore had a particular view. They wanted incorporation into Malaya, or incorporation or merger with Malaya, but they wanted on a different terms. Right? So the question was, what were the terms of that coming together? And that's what the referendum... historians will know of that period will know better than I do about the way the referendum was worded and what the biases in the referendum were that led people to say, because we want to merge, right? So, and there are many people who have written about the various attitudes and the contradictions. We had two prime ministers. We had the Prime Minister of Malaya. We had the Prime Minister of Singapore. There was a Malaysia. I have some wonderful artwork here by Ilani. You can see in the background the mugs.
Malaya is dead.
Long
live Malaysia.
And then this Malaysia is dead.
Malaysia is dead.
Long live Malaya. So
long live Malaya.
There are two permutations.
Okay.
So Ilan also is a Malaysian artist who thinks about history, and she also talks about the erasure of important figures from the East, the erasure of the images in independence. So the image of independence is of Malayan independence, not of Malaysia.
Peninsular.
So Stephen Kalangninkan from Sarawak,
Donald
Stevens from Fuad Stevens in Sabah get written out. Kuan Yew also gets written out of this myth of the building or the story of the building or formation of Malaysia, right? So coming back to James. I think
how did he see Malaya and Singapore?
So there's a very interesting trajectory. Right? So he was at university. He gets involved with the unions. He becomes a secretary of one of these workers' unions. He joins the PAP. He is part of the split in the PAP. And joins the Barisan Socialists. He's detained by Lee Kuan Yew. So he had, when he wrote this book, he was detained by the British. When he wrote, later on he was detained by. He was detained also earlier as a student, and this is very important from a kind of student politics. And Meredith Wise book probably covers this. It's the very famous Fajar trials.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so the Fajar trials was about, Fajar was a magazine by students, and they attacked British colonialism.
Yes.
They were all put on trial, and I believe they were held at St. John's Island off the coast of Singapore.
Yes.
So they were imprisoned there. And this is a time that I think things weren't so nice. And I think there's some recollections about some of the fights that happened, literal fights that happened on the island between all these young people. All these young people, all their passions, we know it today.
Yes.
Right? So people have differences, and there will be new leaders, and there will be competition between, and their personalities, their egos, you're right, and all that, right? So I think all that was there, and some of that is documented about James. Like I said, and I'll say this over and over again, just in case somebody thinks I'm trying to tell the story, that I have the definitive version of the story. I don't, right? But
fragments of the past, like that.
So what I think happens is that he's on the left side of the debate on merger, which was to not to agree to that merger on the terms that were given at that point. They wanted merger, but they wanted a different type of merger. I think that was the issue.
No, because it's very interesting, because I found in one of the article, actually in Singapore, I think, couldn't remember, is it archival, material from Singapore that's have some writings about James lah. So one of the most interesting information that I found, Sharaad, is he's one of the founder of Malayan Student Party. I mean, before we have Muda now, Muda now, what, 2019, 2020, 2020, actually James Puthucheary at that time, even before independent, he founded, a Malayan Student Party. But what is interesting in that article, it said that, trying to build, Malayan consciousness, Malayan Nation, and something, I couldn't remember, but I remember that two words lah, Malayan consciousness and Malayan Nation. So, it's not a deep writing, but it's just an information, which I think if people later on who is interested, to do research, this is very interesting, because you say just now, about how young people at that particular point of time, but for me, at the same time, at that time, among the so-called socialist activists or leftist activists lah, which we categorize James, have this idea of building, the so-called Malayan consciousness.
So, okay, so, I mean, these are really my personal thoughts, right? So, James was at university, his younger brother,
Dominic.
George.
Okay.
He and George were at university, I think about the same time. And there were a lot of, so it goes back to the study of nationalism. Nationalism is artificial. This is why you have to make consciousness, right? So, I mean, you have to build something because it's not actually there naturally, right? And so this is, so what do you have to do? And this is a study of all nationalism. They have to have, a flag. They have, sometimes they struggle over language. Do they have to have a single language? Single language unites people. But we know all the tragedies that have come out of nationalist thinking. Nationalist thinking has been both extraordinarily important as a force of emancipation.
Yes, emancipation.
But it's also been a terrible force, the dark side of nationalism, right?
Yep.
And so, I think they went through all kinds of things. I hear about, I grew up in a house in Johor Bahru, my grandmother's house, right? In the back, in the garage, was was filled with printing presses. My uncles, thought, they would start to produce material. So I grew up with stacks of paper and ink, all rotting and gone, because that was part of a different history, but all stored in my grandmother's house. They thought, intermarriage would be like another Malayan thing, and
Oh, the idea for intermarriage.
Intermarriage. But of course, people have been intermarrying
Interesting.
in Malay,
Of course.
on the peninsula
Yeah.
for 1,000 years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's
Yeah.
more fluid exchange than
Yep.
the Straits of Malacca has water. Okay,
But when he talk about intermarriage between who and who?
whoever, everybody lah. But he himself married a salon burger. He didn't, like I said, some of the assumptions of the old world, were falling apart. He married a salon burger. Salon burgers are the Eurasians of Sri Lanka, as it were, right?
Maybe.
Yeah, it would be
I
Dutch,
didn't know that.
British, English descendants.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So none of this is written. Some of poetry. So there's some poetry that captures. So even in Green's work, in how you create security in a note, you put like a lot of tiny details. There's actually a poem that my uncle wrote. So there's a lot of poetry, and that poetry is documented. All right. So there's a lot of poetry writing in that point in time.
Very interesting, to study.
Yeah, and there's been quite a bit of study. My mother's actually writing a book now, looking at the works of people of that time before 1962, including her brothers George and James, who wrote quite a bit of poetry. So so there's all this struggle about and today we still hold on to some of these nationalist assumptions of a single language. In fact, this year we'll be celebrating the 50th year of the National Cultural Policy, right?
Yeah, Dasar Kebudayaan Kebangsaan, 1971.
Right?
But actually published in 1973.
But the conference was held...
Conference 1971 in University of Malaya. But then the publication of the Dasar Kebudayaan Kebangsaan or National Cultural Policy in 1973.
Yeah. But it's the 50 years of that convention is very important, right? So that I think what's interesting is that the intellectual struggles of James's generation haven't been fully resolved today.
Yes.
Because they go to the heart of some of the contradictions in nationalism. And today we see a lot of tension in the Federation. The Federation already lost one of the four territories, Singapore in 1965. And today we see this real assertion coming from Sabah and Sarawak for their uniqueness. They're saying, actually, we're not all the same. In fact, we don't like what you guys in Malaya do, especially around your racial politics. Not that they don't have racial politics.
They also have.
And they also have their elite, their 1% and all this kind of thing.
Yep.
But it's a very powerful idea.
Yes.
Nationalism remains a powerful idea when people feel oppressed. You feel sidelined. What do? You talk about a nation, because nation is only a community. It's another way of talking a community, right? And so a nation is a community. So the struggle is always, how do you keep the community together in the face of all those forces that will tear it apart? We always talk about race and religion as things that tear it apart. Class. We go back to James's work. Class is a huge thing that is actually underscoring a lot of contemporary. We hear now that fresh grads from Malaysian universities are earning less than minimum wage. I mean, this is how many years since independence, and this is the class reality. Class realities work in particular ways. They maybe express themselves in ethnic, ethno-religious identity politics, but it's still a class issue, right?
Because it is interesting, that you brought it up. Because one of the questions in the seminal book of James Puthucheary is about the concentration of capital ownership. I think he clearly, the concentration of capital ownership on, foreign companies, which he termed as an agency, big firm, agencies, export, import houses, mining, plantations, and all that. But now, coming to now, the current, situation, I do think there is a change, particularly within the so-called Malay community, with, the NEP, Dasar Ekonomi Baru, where there is an expansion of a Malay middle class. But at the same time, which, interesting, if we take back, what James written, where do this concentration capital, help,
Yeah.
which families, the directors, all that lah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's a lot of contemporary, very interesting work. My one regret about my uncle, it's a strange regret to have, is that he didn't keep writing, because I think he was quite, it's a bit of an understatement. I think he was a smart man. He was a smart man who, because he was also slightly given to being unsentimental, he could think more clearly about issues. And I actually, for me, as his nephew, that for me is a very important quality for intellectuals, to be slightly unsentimental, because sentiment often clouds our judgment and our ability.
You get involved with your emotion, your ethnic or religious emotion,
Yeah. And also so
distance
this,
a bit. Yeah.
and the left does this too. So so my uncle, I remember my uncle talking about the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution, right? So when the Soviets rolled in, for him, 1956, that was very important for him in the way he thought about world socialism. And we had a kind of three-block world, right? We had the first world, capitalist, we had the socialist world, the second world, and we had the third world, right? The undeveloped, non-aligned world, as it were. So Bandung happened during that period. But remember,
Bandung Conference.
Yeah, I think Malaysia was not represented because Malaysia was not independent yet,
yes,
right?
Yes.
But it's very interesting that the issues for him that emerge in our discussion were things like the Soviet invasion of Hungary, right? And we know, of course, later on we had the Prague Spring, and then suppression of the Czech communists by the Soviets, right? So my uncle became much more critical of this world socialist plan when you saw this kind of power. Hungary is something he mentioned to me, right? And you over and over again, there were things that were conscientizing and politicizing young people. Suez, Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, the attempt to nationalize the Suez Canal, and then the British, response, and then also the failures. So Gamal Nasser tried to have this pan-Arab politics, and Syria was incorporated and all these things, and then it failed, right? So there was a volatile time, a lot of ideas, a lot of practical application of ideas, but also a lot of failures and reversals. So I think any intellectual worth their salt today, especially if they think of them in the left, is not to be nostalgic about the left of the 50s. Not to assume that James or all those people in his generation were perfect, heroic, pure of spirit, all these kinds of things, right? So when we go back to the past, we need to bring a very critical look at it. And I saw that my uncle was never willing to get into this hatred of, say, Lee Kuan Yew, right? Because for him, that was a struggle. He was on the losing side. Okay, he was on the losing side, and he was not interested to make Lee Kuan Yew into an evil person or whatever. Not at least in his personal discussions about it. My regret is my uncle didn't write more about the politics as it was unfolding throughout the years. And he had other interests, I guess. But there was a privatization of their own, thoughts. Dominic, his brother, remained political. I think today he's still political and still involved in some ways in different types of politics. James's brother George also has long passed away, and he was a headmaster after university. So they all have gone, in their ways. But during that time, that very crucial 50s and 60s, and then because in James's case also the 40s, because he was politically, he was old enough to get involved. He got involved.
Yeah. So he's being banished, from Singapore in 1963. Correct, huh?
Actually, I don't know what the year is.
Okay. I think so, from in 1960s, to put it at a safe side, in 1960s. Then he came to KL, and worked at a screen or scribe. How do you
screen
pronounce it?
screen company.
Screen company. A very huge, law firm. Very established. When he's in Malaysia, that time lah, in Peninsular Malaysia, do you know anything, about his, involvement in politics? Because I've read a lot about James Puthucheary involvement, in a Singapore politics, but I haven't heard much, about his involvement in
Malaysian
politics. Yeah.
Okay, so
but then Sharaad, I haven't heard, but then his second launching of his second edition, of the No Cowardly Pass, it's been launched by Kuli Tengku Razali Hamzah. I mean, when he's passed away, in memoriam, of his funeral, Mahathir's cup came down. So I was like thinking, so this is like, the giant of the so-called Malay politics, Kuli, Mahathir, give their respect lah towards James. But I haven't heard much, of his involvement in politics, in Malaysia.
Yeah. Okay, so just to understand how he turns to the legal studies. So while he was in detention, I think a man called Lee Sheridan, was an English professor who of law at the University of Singapore, started tutoring him in law. So that's how he gets into legal studies. Okay, and I just want to mention Lee Sheridan because. Again, so all these people in this universe who get forgotten. I mean, James, James is not so visible anymore. Right? And even more so, a whole range of people that we've been talking about, the Lim Chin Siongs, and that some historians, of course, Tim Harper has written a wonderful book called "Comet in the Sky" by Lim Chin Siong.
Yeah, Lim Chin Siong, Comet in the Sky.
But Lee Sheridan is another important character in the sense that he plays a part, right? So in my uncle's journey, Lee Sheridan, the late Lee Sheridan. So what the little fragments, the fragments I know. One is when Mahathir is thrown out of UMNO, James and Mavis drive up to Kedah to meet him. Oh, when he's
thrown out from UMNO, 1967.
Yeah.
1960s lah. This is
when Malay Dilemma.
Malay Dilemma. He's thrown out from UMNO.
They go and visit.
Oh, James and Mavis went down to Kedah.
Yeah, but I don't know the content. So if you're a historian, you want to follow
very interesting.
Yeah.
That's a very close relationship, between Mahathir and James.
So you remember in the 50s when James at university, Mahathir is there too. And he doesn't get involved in the Socialist Club. And he's writing his Chet Dead column.
Yes.
Right? So he is in the same space.
Yes.
So look, the truth of the matter is universities at that time are elite institutions. We're talking a couple of hundred people. Right? From the entire nation who are getting a university education. Yes. Very interesting fact. My aunt, Mavis Puthucheary, who subsequently becomes James's wife, she and a bunch of young students do a tour of Sri Lanka and India. Okay, they go on a student history club tour. Who do they meet at the end of this tour? Jawaharlal Nehru.
Wow.
They have tea with Nehru. So I was asking my aunt, I said, why would the Prime Minister of this huge country want to meet with students? And she said to me, well, we were seen potentially as new leaders of a new nation. Hadn't started yet, but this was going to be. So it's very interesting. They were elites. University students were elites in the way they're no longer elites in this country, and they had a prominence, right? So they would have known each other. They would have known each other in the way that's impossible today because there literally are like 100,000. Any cohort is like 100,000. You only know the ones or two who become prominent.
Usually in your own department lah. In your department. But during that time, there's very, the number is small. So
I think that I don't know about so I know a little bit about that. But we come back to this whole thing I think I mentioned earlier, which is that and the issue whether he was or wasn't the architect of NEP and what his relationship to Razak was. And all
Yes,
that.
yes.
So Razak was criticized by some segments of the left as being a kind of fake ersatz socialist, like a not, he had a lot of socialistic ideas. And then he's always credited as father nation, blah blah, Felda,
Yes.
right? But and there's where maybe you can see why James and his intellectual disposition might work with a Razak, right? In thinking about policy, how do we change, right? There's corporate ownership, right? So you talk about the plantations and, all these trading houses, all that. So shifting, we know there was a huge move to capture, right? By this
The foreign ownership,
ownership.
by the state themselves.
And then there was a question of how do you change the economic structure so that you have more balance? Iqmal Said writes a wonderful piece about the left and how the left was driven by some of the contradictions within the working class base, right?
I read that article.
Right? I think it's in Fragmented Visions or something that Francis Lowe puts together. So I think it's anyone wanting to call themselves a leftist today bloody should read that essay by Iqmal Said. And also, I think, recognizing that the NEP in its initial construction was a limited policy vehicle. It was supposed to deal with the historical inequalities, not just in the corporate sector, but in terms of equity holding, but also in opportunities, right? But it has become captured. It's been captured by a particular class, and it's captured by a particular identity politics, and as a consequence, it's gone in a very, perhaps a different way. But I can't speak for my uncle. I mean, I don't know what my uncle would say today looking at where the country has gone. Right? So there he was, 80s, 90s. Malaysia's booming, right?
Yes, of course.
Booming.
Yep.
Right? But today, and post the Reformasi crisis, we've been in crisis for 2 decades. The economy is weak. Now, Terence Gomez and other scholars are now looking at China, the rise of Chinese investments. And only a couple recently... our foreign minister goes to China or speaks to the Chinese foreign minister and refers to China as the elder brother. So what is national sovereignty today? What does independence mean? Where are we in the globe? What bargaining strength do we have vis-a-vis all the big players, right? How much foreign ownership is there in the Malayan economy today? How much does it impact policy? How much is policy being written with the view of foreign investors on one hand versus local capitalists on the other hand versus, hegemonic forces like China on the other hand who have their own Belt and Road, blah, blah, plans. So there are a lot of questions, I think, today that, James might have been, I think, when I think about James and his contribution is that you need a kind of intellectual disposition like that. And that's what comes back to me. That he was very it seemed like, slightly intellectually speaking, unsentimental. And which is good. Which is good.
Actually, we have prepared, like a 20 question, I know that we can't answer, all those 20 questions, but at least we get a fragment, of who is James Puthucheary, what is his thinking, his ideas, and hopefully, people, the audience who watch our program or listen to our podcast, can, but there is not much, in internet about James, but I would recommend, this book, Ownership and Control in the Malayan Economy, and also No Cowardly Past, the one that been launched by Tengku Razali, I think a couple of years back, but this is very important because for me, myself, this is one of the book that, opened up, my own mind in looking at how the economic structure have been organized by the colonial system and we inherit it, until now, even though when there is a state intervention, which is partly been suggested by Jim, still within the structure we still have some problems, particularly in terms of identity politics, ethnicization of economic sphere. But hopefully, from this conversation, very informal conversation with Sharaad Kuttan. Actually, Sharaad is you haven't told that you are actually a talk show host.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, a talk show host in Astro Awani. Yeah? Usually in Astro Awani, if you Google Sharaad Kuttan, on YouTube, you will see all this Let's Talk with Sharaad.
Sharaad. I consider this.
Yeah, usually Sharaad, his role is to grill and roast, other people. But I'm not roasting him or grilling him. We exchange, information and also knowledge about, someone who I myself have very little knowledge. And hopefully our audience can also gain, some information, knowledge about, just to quote, Karim Raslan actually wrote about James Puthucheary, in Cerita Lah. If I'm not mistaken, his column in The Star, he categorized, James as the towering Malaysian. In fact, in that article, Karim Raslan lamenting, how would we, in this current situation, with the political mess, some, unresolved ethnic identity problem, would we Malaysian have, figure like James Puthucheary again? Yeah. So, terima kasih kepada semua yang menonton dan yang mendengar siri Melawan Lupa daripada Kawah Buku, dan kami harapkan dengan perbincangan ini kita memperolehi manfaat dan juga maklumatlah tentang salah seorang daripada I would say pembina-pembina awal lah kepada Malaysia pada hari ini. So, terima kasih banyak-banyak. Sharaad?
Sama-sama.
Ini nak salam ke nak? Okey, ini kau bilang. Okey, terima kasih banyak-banyak kepada Sharaad, dan terima kasih kepada Atta dan juga kepada Azan, 2 orang je technical crew, dan terima kasih kepada penonton dan juga pendengar podcast. Sampai berjumpa lagi di lain masa di siri Melawan Lupa, dan juga ada satu lagi siri dekat Kawah Buku iaitu Menjadi Malaysia. Sekian, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Terima kasih semua.